I was in New York 2 weeks ago or a week and a half ago. My mom lives on Long Island. This is Atlantic Beach here. And you can see what Atlantic Beach sort of, this is what it typically the way they maintain beaches in the Rockaways, which you guys have, if you haven't been there, you've heard it in the news. Atlantic Beach, so this is what you typically see there. Some areas, though, actually have some dunes left. They're remnant, or they've stretched them in front of the town. I've been telling these guys really for years that, you know, this is a hurricane waiting to happen. As someone says, if you can see the ocean can see you, right? So, you know, if you have an ocean view, the ocean's coming. So it was amazing to me. So these are the houses that are behind that dune system, right there. And this is right at the edge, right where there aren't any dunes. So the beach came right in, and that first floor just fell in. And you can see them here taking that sand back out of that house. I mean, it couldn't have been really a more cut and dry example. So that's the dune back there. You can see a grass still here and here. All those houses are directly damaged. I'm going to go there this winter and try and talk to these landowners and say, you guys might consider having dunes there. I really know they are still really, they want to do business as usual as far as I can tell. Just go back and put it exactly the way it was before. If they put those dunes in, it's good for me too, because it saves one of my favorite creatures on the planet, which is the piping plover, an endangered species there. That's caused these landowners a lot of heartache because they want to maintain and continually grade this area. Anyway, how does this tie into whales? I'm going to try my best at the end of this talk to come back to this and show how whales are relevant to this system. So for most of human history, this is what we would have known about a whale, right? It would have been an exhalation, or a first surfacing. Exhalation could be, for gray whales, blue whales, 10 meters high, really huge. And just this glistening of the back, and then the animal diving, and you don't really know what else was going on beneath the surface. Because of that, there was lots of speculation about what the animals, the creatures might have looked like beneath the sea, and fear and concern about these animals. For me, Leviathan or whale before we had biology and before we were looking at evolutionary connections, are really animals with spouts. So you can see lots of species with spouts here. And to enforce the idea that we really didn't know often what was going on, this was described as a leviathan in the 15th century by a Swedish naturalist. And it was the word for fins was mistranslated into claws in the Latin. And this species persisted for 200 years in the French Academy and in several academies as being a species in nature, all because of a mistranslation. So once you get these in to the system, it's very hard to get them out again, right? It's very hard to change them. Of course, there's one other way that we related to whales for at least several thousand years, and that is by hunting them. This is the oldest known image of whaling. It's from a petroglyph in South Korea. Dates back about 2,000 to 6,000 years ago. You can see the boat and the men sitting on that boat, and comes from a cave system, and then that's probably a right whale or a gray whale, basically because those would have been the two slow-swimming coastal species that you would have seen there.
Do you know how big that whole drawing is?
I don't, but I think it's, from the picture I've seen, about that big, I guess. But yeah, I don't know. So, several thousand years, we have this relationship among some cultures. One of them is the Pacific, going from Japan all the way to the Northwest Pacific in the US. You've got this culture, similar hunting techniques. As far as we know, it was sustainable. We don't really have any evidence of whale declines at that time. Of course, it's hard to find evidence of that. But we do know that things changed a lot with commercial whaling. First records of commercial whaling are by the Basques in 1000 AD. There are some receipts from around that time. Basques were hunting right whales. That's the one on the upper plate there. Originally hunted for their meat, for the tongue mostly, and whales, of course, were considered fish in the Catholic Church, so they were eaten during Lent. There were lots of Lenten days in those times, so that was an important product of that. Of course, they were also hunted for two other products. One was the oil, and also the baleen, These are mysticetes or filter feeders, and they can have plates that are several meters long, 10 feet, up to 15 feet long. And they were used for, think of things that we would use for plastic now, everything from umbrellas to fishing rods to bed springs, lots of other products as well. So it was very common in the house. When sperm whales, which are toothed whales, weren't really hunted extensively till around the 17th century, and this is an American tradition, started by maybe myth or stories around Nantucket. As the right whale populations were declining, they were looking for alternative species, and they turned to sperm whales. They were hunted mostly for their oil. This sperm whale oil was used to light lighthouses, candles, basically anything, street lights. The American revolutionaries were very happy to say that the British were going to suffer during the war because they weren't going to have access to oil, and they were going to, London streets were going to go dark as a result of the war. And Britain indeed did start buying oil again from the colonies very soon after the war. So this product was used mostly to light the night, but the main product for baleen rarely saw the light of day. And baleen was mostly hunted for corsets. Enough that the baleen from a single whale was enough to pay for an entire cruise. It was that valuable. An entire cruise that could last as populations were declining for a year, 2 years, even up to 3 years. You can see there, that's about the extreme, that wasp waist in the 19th century, when waists were about as tight as they could be. This was started, the tradition was started in the 15th century by Mary Tudor of England, and then Catherine de' Medici of France got wind of this. She wasn't going to be beat in fashion by a Brit. She declared that the ideal waist was 15 inches, about the circumference of a CD. Right? Women, this could clearly cause miscarriages, problems with lungs, broken ribs. So great pain to women, but of course it was much worse for the whale. This is a picture of the Arctic Oil Works, a port in San Francisco, and these are the baleen plates here. Kind of looks like home, right? These are from bowhead whales. We basically wiped out the bowhead whale population by the end of the 19th century. And this hunt was never intended to be, we talk about sustainability now, that was never the intent of this hunt. Whalers went in and hit them as hard as they could. And they didn't tell anyone else about it, and if they could go in and get rid of an entire population on their own, that was probably a good business move for them, right? They were secretive, but word often got out, and cruises would last longer and longer over the years. So that's basically 19th century. This is hand whaling up until that point. We managed to dispatch right whales and bowhead whales at that time. Several species were too fast swimming or small, so we didn't bother to hunt them until the 20th century, when things actually, unfortunately, got worse for whales. This is a record of the hunt of whales in the southern hemisphere. The black line is the total number of whales killed. First species, once we had these, were called factory ships. So they had diesel-powered catcher boats that were fast, and factory ships that they could render species or large animals very quickly. It was said, and they also used spotter planes to look for whales. It was said that once a whale was seen, it was pretty much caught. There wasn't really very little chance for a whale to make it. They went after blue whales first. Why? Largest animals on the planet, so you get big bang for your buck. Blue whale populations declined to very low until 1930s, 1940s. What happened then? Yeah. Well, World War II. These were among the most highly technical ships on the planet, and among some of the fastest. So the catcher boats were used to go after submarines in the North Pacific and in the North Atlantic, And those large factory ships were used to transport planes. They were used on the attack by the Japanese in the attack of Pearl Harbor. That's how they brought some of the ships over. So they were brought for transport. Not such a good time to be a human maybe at that time, but maybe this the only time the whales get a little bit of a break, at least in the southern hemisphere. Northern hemisphere, they might have been damaged by other impacts. The problem is, of course, as soon as the war ends, they're hit just as hard as ever before, yeah?
I'm just surprised to see that peak in the 60s, and I was wondering what the demand was on whales and why the peak then.
Right. So two things. The whale. Well, of course. So there's a famous slide showing whales celebrating the discovery of oil in Pennsylvania in the 1870s, right? And they, it's a big cetacean party because they're going to be released of that pressure. And there was petroleum did replace it, but they were used for lubrication. Whale oil was used for lubrication, especially sperm whale oil at that time. In fact, that was one of the big arguments about stopping the protection of large whales in the U.S. in the 1960s and 1970s. Defense Department and Commerce Department wanted to continue hunting sperm whales for lubrication. And the laws said, well, if the population has declined, you have to protect them. Finally, DuPont stepped in and made artificial oil, and since then that's been the replacement. They're also hunted for margarine, perfumes, dog food. So some high things and some very low things. And Norwegians, Japanese, Icelanders, a couple of other groups still eat the whale meat as well. That would be the reason why you'd be hunting those minke whales and smaller whales. At that point, it was really just for meat. But keep in mind that there are international agreements. International Whaling Commission started right after World War II, and you can see their impact. They really did fail to manage this population at all. By the 1970s, 1980s, there are protest groups, Greenpeace, and there's movements in countries like the US and the UK to reduce hunting and, in fact, to stop it altogether. And in 1986, international moratorium on whaling at that point. So all commercial whaling stops in 1986. You guys know, if you watch TV or read the news, that doesn't mean that whaling has stopped. Japan's continued to hunt them and continues to this day. They claim it's for science. Interesting historical fact is the US insisted on that loophole when the law went in. They insisted that there would be a loophole for science because they wanted, at the time, it was thought that people were going to want to resume whaling again, and they wanted to have the ability to look at dietary fluctuation in gray whales. In particular, problem is other countries have used it in other ways. Very little science, feel free to take a seat. Very little science has come from the Japanese studies of whales at that point. And I'll show you one reason why I think that is. What has come though is lots of meat on the market. They're allowed to sell it at whatever they have after the commercial hunt, rather the scientific hunt.
So how many are we collecting for tissue samples?
Several hundred up to 1,000 a year.
Okay.
Minke whales, and now it's a few other species. So a lot, and you might have been able to argue this in 1986, but nowadays, as you guys know, I mean, a little piece of skin can give you a ton of information on DNA, on stable isotopes. You really don't need to harvest whales anymore in order to study them. Yeah.
How does that compare with the Norwegian?
The Norwegians did a different tack. They just decided they were going to pull out. So they said, we're hunting, and we're just not going to be part of the IWC. So instead of making that, they said, we'll pull out. And they are, and they seem to be more transparent. I'm going to show you what happened with the Japanese hunt in a moment, and I could discuss, the Norwegians have taken a different approach to that. So there were concerns by some conservation groups about the Japanese whaling, not only that they were continuing to whale, but also that maybe there were some other species getting onto the marketplace. They said that just minke whales were there, but some conservation groups, particularly based in Hawaii, perhaps there were other species getting there. So Naoko Funahashi, shown here in silhouette on purpose, went around Japan, she was Japanese national, buying whale meat from throughout the country. From sushi bars, from supermarkets and sushi bars. When the chef would turn his back, she'd put the meat in her pocket, and she would take all of these samples back to Tokyo and meet with some American scientists who were going to analyze this DNA. The scientists had to come to her, had to come to Japan, of course, because it was illegal to transport meat commercially or without a permit. Japanese aren't going to give you a permit if they know what these guys were up to, right? So she brought those samples back to a hotel room in Tokyo, and starting in 1993 was the first time this was done, and they set up a DNA lab in that hotel. I joined them in the late 1990s and worked on this project. And well, you could see her do not disturb. We always got funny looks by the people that owned the hotel, because one, we barely left the room, and two, there was white powder and all these high-end lab equipment here, and a bunch, of foreigners. Nonetheless, they never got busted. We never got busted for this. And in those, I don't think nowadays it's harder to transport this stuff. In those days, they would take all these samples out and just not declare them. What they were doing is making DNA copies and bringing the copies out, so they could argue that there's none of the original whale. You can't even bring out a single strand of whale DNA without a permit, but if you make a copy of it, you can. The Japanese contested that, but lost that battle. DNA is considered, you don't need a permit to make a copy of the DNA and take it out. So, what did they find? Everything in red here are illegal samples. So, this is what the Japanese claimed they were hunting. The minke whale from the North Pacific, the Antarctic minke, and the Brutus whale. And species that have been protected since 1937 were showing up on that marketplace. Species that they claimed hadn't been hunted since the 1960s were there. Blue whales and humpback whales. Sperm whales were there. Says and fins. Clear evidence that some illegal whaling was getting onto that marketplace, and clear concern about the sustainability or the believability of this hunt at this point. More, this dwarfs lifeless of most whale biologists. I haven't seen this many species. You also see that some odd species show up in the market too, like sheep, horse, and toothed whales, which are dolphins and porpoises. A concern for health, since they're high on the food chain, they tend to absorb lots of heavy metals. So the whale in Japan is sold as clean fish, basically, or clean meat, because they tend to use zooplankton or forage fish, so they should be relatively clean, but that's not what they're getting. The first response was contamination. Hard to imagine how we could get contamination in a Tokyo hotel room of any of these species. Contamination, DNA contamination, but they went back and showed they did these analyses in 2 different labs, one lab in New Zealand, one lab in Hawaii. Then they said, well, they've had these in the freezer all this time. Problem with that was they've been doing this study for more than a decade now. New individuals because you can do this to individual level, new individuals keep showing up. So unless they have some massive freezer with lots of whale meat in it, which they have not disclosed that they do, it seems almost certain that some of these are a result of pirate whaling. So the Japanese have been claiming, and not only that, I don't mean to only pick on the Japanese here, that is a problem, but this is their website, but the Norwegians, Canadians will argue this as well, that one of the problems with increases in whale populations is that they're competition for human fisheries. They compete with our fish. So as you can see here, I accessed this today. This is their website. I want to see if they're still making this claim. It's the Japanese Ministry of Foreign Affairs. It's competition with fisheries, and it's also a conservation claim. They say they're doing whales a favor by killing minke whales, because minke whale populations have increased, they claim, at the expense of other endangered species. And the reason why, says, fins and blues aren't doing so well is because minkies are there. That we can argue that, and in fact, I think I had this in the back of my mind after I'd gotten back doing that work in Japan. I was at the University of Florida at the time. So I was taking marine ecology soon after I got back from Japan, and I was learning about this process called the biological pump. And for those of you who haven't studied marine ecology, biological pump is essentially photosynthesis, of course, can only occur at the surface, near where the sun is. And a lot of carbon and other nutrients drop out either because of ideal migration or because of death or decomposition, you're losing phytoplankton, zooplankton, higher level zoos. That carbon and other nutrients are dropping to the bottom of the ocean, right? Taking out. Well, I was sitting back in the in the class, and about a year and a half ago, I insulated my attic and came across my notes from marine ecology. At that time, I was really and I found this note from this class. You know, I'd been studying whales for a long time at that point. And I realized when we watch whales, though, what they do is they feed at depth. They'll come up at their surface with mud on their heads. They're feeding in the benthic area there. And they come to the surface, and before they dive, they often poop. So they're actually doing something opposite of the biological pump, right? That instead of bringing nutrients out, they're bringing nutrients back to the surface. And the feces of whales is sort of like a big plume, so it doesn't tend to drop out, it tends to go, it's watery and tends to stay suspended in that upper layer. So anyway, this is my little drawing of the right whale, seeing the poop and the copepods and phytoplankton in there. I was a graduate student, so I had to schedule even time. I was eating there, and I was also thinking about, at that point, because I was looking at right whales, there were only about 400 right whales in the area in the whole ocean. So I was thinking, well, it's probably not that big of an ecological impact. We only have 400, but what happens when there were 10, 20, 50 times more whales in these systems? What would that have been like? So, if you haven't seen a fecal plume, this is a sperm whale.
Wow.
This is the sperm whale fecal plume, and this is the idea that we started to develop. After that, it took me several years to work on this because my master's and PhD wasn't about this, but I've been wanting to study this for a while. Finally, after finishing my PhD, I had a chance to get out in the field and look at what we described as the whale pump. And here's tag data for a fin whale. You can see just how deep they dive down to feed. They're not going to go down to those depths because it's energetically expensive unless it's to eat. And they shut down most of their internal organs, so they shouldn't be metabolizing. But this is a fin whale, and then they're coming back. And this is where they're metabolizing resting at the surface. Right? So support for the fact that they would be releasing the nutrients at the surface. So we submitted this work to a few journals, and we wanted to know, first of all, whether it was ecologically relevant. You know, okay, well, there's some poop at the surface. Does this actually have an impact in a coastal system? And we were looking at the Gulf of Maine here off of Massachusetts and the coast of Maine. We found, yeah, I mean, given the number of whales in the system, more than all rivers, more nitrogen, and nitrogen is the limiting factor here. There's more nitrogen being delivered to the surface waters in the Gulf of Maine by whales than all the rivers combined. Not quite as much as coastal point source, which is us, what we're releasing there. And atmospheric deposition is a lot more. The difference between what whales do and atmospheric deposition is whales are concentrated in relatively small areas and areas of high productivity. This was what we proposed. Originally, we also included, and we still have those numbers, seabirds, since they're doing a similar process. They're not diving as deep pinnipeds. Any air-breathing animal is going to be doing some cycle like this. Whale biomass is much higher than it is for those, at least in this system. And whales are also tending to use the whole water column in their feeding as well. So we submitted that, and it got rejected, and one of our reviewers said, well, you guys are, so that was just, we didn't go in the field and measure this, we did an estimate of whale numbers in the area. We said, that's great, but you guys are there, you've got all these whales there, you should be going out into the field and collecting this. It's exactly what you want to hear, is right, you know, if you just submit this paper, it's like, great, you gotta go out. So there you've got the picture of an idealized one. It was in 2007. It was considered by Popular Science as one of the 10 worst jobs. Collecting whale.
Wait, related to your stuff, or?
It was another study that was out there, and I'll show that.
About whale poop?
Whale poop, yeah. So there were other people studying it. Why else would you want to collect whale poop? Well, you can look at reproductive status, you can look at hormones, you can look at toxins, you can look at DNA, you can get DNA from that. So there are other reasons to go out there and collect it. In fact, for my initial collection, I worked with other folks that have been going out into the system. one of the limiting factors about collecting whale poop is finding it. You know, is finding it in the ocean. So colleagues of mine, Roz Rolland and Scott Krause, had a brilliant, I think, a really cool idea. They hired a sniffer dog to look for scat at the sea. This is Fargo. He's a 90-pound Rottweiler. His first job was companion animal to an elderly woman after she died. He got a job as a sniffer dog in a prison in Pacific Northwest. And then got, I think, what for many dogs would be a dream job. He became a wildlife detective dog. So he went out his initial work was on grizzlies and other large species, but someone
There's
thought...
gotta be a book there.
yeah, I think it's probably in the works. So there's one of his colleagues is named Tucker, and he does his work on killer whales. If they're not writing the book, they should be. But probably the movie has been optioned. Anyway, this is a North Atlantic right whale, one of the most endangered animals on the planet, and that's Fargo. His colleague Bob only lasted one season because he was terrified of whales. So he used to hide when the whales surfaced nearby. And Fargo's limitation was he got seasick, so he had to take Dramamine before every trip. But it was really effective.
How did he like indicate that you guys were close?
Good. So dogs, the way the trainers do it is usually it's the tail wagging. Oh. But Rottweilers only have small tails, so they called it the happy inch. so when he's excited, he's on a tail. I'll show you this. You can see it here. Here's a scent cone for this is one of the better scent cones because it's a nautical mile away. He gets a detection. When you see that, it means detection, detection, detection. When you get the X, that means he's out. He stops tail wagging, and you know you're out of the scent cone. So you move back in, and you've got evidence of the detection, and then he stops, and you're going upwind, of course, and eventually you find it. That black dot is when humans can smell it. So we can smell whale poop at about 100 meters. Dogs can smell it at about a nautical mile. So really increase the ability to find these samples. This is not how this was work that I wrote about, but I wasn't collecting. This was before I was collecting samples. I'm going to show you in a moment how we got several of our samples. You can see there the collection methods, and again that these samples have been incredibly valuable for all kinds of reasons. So I was working with these guys. It was just an opportunistic chance to follow whales all day, because once you had that tag on, what you had to do is follow them every time they surface, so you get an idea of their position, and then you get some amazing amount of information off of those whales. Those guys have learned a ton from putting those tags on it. Now they've even this year put on critter cams, so it's just beautiful stuff, seeing interactions between different humpback whales. So the information that we got out of this work was one, that there indeed were high ammonium or nitrogen concentrations in those areas, an order of magnitude, 2 orders of magnitude higher than the background concentration in those areas. So clear evidence that they are releasing the limiting nutrient into that system. And then we did several incubation experiments looking at the release of ammonium out of the particulate nitrogen, out of that fecal plume that you see there, and you see an increased concentrations of ammonium over time, and that concentration is increasing over time. So this is releasing out into that surface area. Why does this matter temporally? So I've shown you why I think it's important on an ecological sense, but it's very important when the whales are there. If they were there in the wintertime, it wouldn't be so critical, because in the wintertime, and that's the far left there, you have lots of mixing. So there's tons of nutrients in the system, but you don't have a lot of sunlight, so you don't have a lot of productivity. When there's increased sun, you get what's called a thermocline. You get the warm water at the top, where you can have phytoplankton, where you can have photosynthesis rather, but you lose nutrients. And then all the nutrients are at the bottom there. So what are the whales are doing? One, they're here only really in the summertime. This is residence. So this is when the whales are found in that area. And they're breaking that thermocline, and even physically breaking down that thermocline by swimming back and forth in it, but they're also releasing those nutrients. So they're doing this at a time when the nutrients are most limiting, is when you're finding the whales in that system. Okay? So you remember that early on we had I had written, well, we know that populations are greatly reduced from what they were historically. What would it look like in the past? Then they really played an important role. One, because humans are taking the coastal point source, the sewage, out of the system. This is before humans started hunting whales, before we started impacting the system. Atmospheric deposition is greatly reduced by about 80%, are the estimates, that by taking humans out of the system, without industry, without agriculture. And then whale populations, of course, were much higher. And this is still contested about how high they were in the past. This is from our estimates using genetics. We think that whale populations were very high in the past. But no matter how you look at it, even if you do a very conservative, very low estimate, they're having a much bigger impact on the ocean system at that time.
So it's really interesting to think about the whales having a larger impact prior to human impact. I wonder if you have practical implications scientifically, politically, in terms of ecological economics theory, et cetera.
Yeah, I mean, we argue that primary a couple of answers there, but that primary productivity would be higher when whales are in an area, and it's often been argued the opposite, that productivity in general is lower with whales in the system. That they're looking at secondary, they're looking at fish populations, but when you have whales in the system, it creates higher numbers for basically the whole system in these hotspots of activity. So I think that's an important comment. And also, I mean, you sort of jumping to my next slide, it very much conflicts the idea that culling marine mammals, which is still on the table in lots of countries. Marine Mammal Protection Act here in the United States kind of keeps that off the table. But many countries, including Canada and Norway, are trying to bring back culls of marine mammals for this region. I think the whale pump changes that view. And as I was going to discuss in a moment, it also is important for carbon sequestration. It changes the amount of carbon in a system, and I'll show you a slide about that later on. Yeah.
So, can you go back a slide?
Yeah.
So I'm thinking about nitrogen as a limiting nutrient. Could it have been that there were so many whales pooping so much that nitrogen wasn't in fact limiting?
That would be very interesting.
Something else would have limited things?
Yeah, that's right. So,
Okay, so then the flip side of that is, it seems like from the past to now, we've replaced whale deposition of nitrogen at the surface with two other new sources,
right.
Coastal point source and atmospheric. And so it's almost the same question. Maybe nitrogen's not as limiting as would have been true with loss of whales, because we've replaced that nitrogen with our own sources.
That's right. Absolutely.
So I'm trying to figure out what that does to your arguments that whales would increase productivity, because we already fertilized the living daylight out of the surface.
That's right, but it's a matter of where. It's the oceans, because we get this argument from reviewers, and the ocean's very patchy. And so these areas where whales are found are on these productivity hotspots, often on banks, where that coastal point source. I mean, you guys know where this is coming from. I think of Mississippi. You get these dead zones. This is not going to the same area, and it's impacting it in a different way. Atmospheric deposition, is broad scale, and that I'm sure that takes up some. I imagine that takes up some of the loss from whales. I mean, that is increasing probably productivity in these areas. But think about it. It's just it's just falling out, sort of like a blanket, as opposed to these little hot spots. Yeah. So that's one of the big differences. But certainly
So you're saying that this whale pump is not distributed evenly around the world because whales are more active in some places.
Absolutely.
And I'm not a whale biologist at all, but my impression is that whales are more active in the temperate zone and further north, where there's the limitation of winter too. But in the tropics, there isn't that same limitation. And then also, if you think about kind of agriculture and where agriculture is more productive, it's in warmer climates where there's also then more deposition. So it seems like there's basically kind of a disjunct between, what was formerly potentially a driver of kind of nitrogen, accumulation in these areas versus what's now available. So so basically more temperate areas are suffering potentially more.
I see.
Than
the tropical areas are?
Yeah.
Because you're taking away. Well, certainly that would have a bigger impact on tropical areas. and as far as the whale pump goes. But when I was in Brazil, I realized that there was a piece missing. So you've actually led me into that was a perfect question. It sort of led me into the next slide, which is that whales do feed in these areas. This is humpbacks. 10,000 humpbacks, 20,000 I think is the number now, travel to Brazil to breed every year. And they don't feed there. They're there for 3 or 4 months and they're having babies. But they're not feeding, so their feed here, South Sandwich Islands, is the coast of Brazil, but they're metabolizing, so they don't poop, but they urinate. So the nitrogen is still being passed into these areas, and these are very low productivity areas. So this is sort of the next thing I'm trying to look at, is get a handle on what the impact, is it ecologically important, and how are they delivering these nutrients. They're also releasing nutrients, they die. So they're bringing nutrients in the form of carcasses, placentas as well. So I think this is important enough. I like sort of goofy titles, so I call it the Great Whale Conveyor Belt. And these circles here show you where they feed, and lighter is higher productivity, and where they breed. So darker is lower productivity. So they breed 10,000, 20,000 whales breed off of the Dominican Republic and off of Brazil. So just in the Atlantic alone, they're bringing, we did an off-the-cuff estimate of this, but they're bringing thousands of tons of nitrogen into these systems. These systems have very low productivity, so it should be important. The question is, can we find, it's sort of like that again, that you go back to the field, like how we can find poop. It's not that easy, but it's really hard to find pee. I don't really know how.
One thing I was wondering is just the kind of, I guess, the density of the poop in comparison to like ocean water. And because you were talking about the settling of the nutrients, I was just wondering kind of what is that time period like? Is it permanently in suspension and it just gets rapidly used up, or is it settling?
I'm going to give you one so Dave Wiley, who I've worked with, did studies in the 70s on, they used to dump sludge off of New York City. That's how they got rid of their crap, which is taking and dumping it off, and there were whales in that area, so he was working on an observer there, and they measured it, and almost all of that sludge was sitting at the top above that thermocline. And this is just an anecdotal answer to that question. But, so the human feces tends not to drop out. It was mostly sitting up above that thermocline, as we suspect is happening with whales. But some particulates certainly drop out, and we don't know what percent that is. It's very watery, and it's sort of like a cloud. I describe it as like green tea. It really doesn't. It doesn't often. It depends. Every species is different too.
Right. Yeah. Because I was just thinking, if you want to really hold those estimates as to what that nitrogen.
Yeah. So we don't have I don't have a percentage yet, but certainly some of it is dropping out. I don't know really how to get at that yet. So a couple of other things, other ways that whales engineer ocean ecosystems is one is physically. Gray whales feed at the benthic. Right in the sand and in the mud on amphipods, and they're mixing that system. So there's what the elusive for many oceanographers, that benthic pelagic coupling, a coupling between the species that are living in the benthos and that are living in that area. And these last centuries, we can see these furrows over time, and then sort of one of the most compelling, I think, engineered ecosystems by whales, intentionally engineered, these bubble nets. So they're diving deep, humpbacks do this, they're releasing air bubbles beneath a school of fish, and that's capturing them in this, what's really a spiral, or called a bubble net. And so this is clearly an engineered system. It doesn't last very long. It only lasts a few seconds, but it's one example of physical engineering. This is the work that I've been involved with now, looking at not only the whale pump, but how whales are impacting ocean ecosystems, because they've often been viewed as passengers in the ocean, and I think they're drivers too. And so we looked at the whale pump, of course, and black indicates how they impacted the system in the past, gray how they impact it now. I won't spend much time on this because I don't have it, but whale falls are very important as well. And you mentioned, Bob mentioned trophic cascades. There's another way that whales impact the entire system. This is work done by Jim Estes and his colleagues. Orcas, historically ate gray whales and humpback whales. We take those whales out of the system. They prey switched. They switched first to seals, and then to sea otters, And if you're familiar with that story, sea otters feed on sea urchins. You take the otters out of the system, urchins increase, and you lose kelp forests. And they have done a very interesting, very controversial study making these connections from the orca there all the way now to studies that include changes in how bald eagles feed and seeing lots of knock-on effects by this. Oh, I will tie in from the beginning why whales might matter to my mom's house, or people who live on the coast, is there have been estimates of how much carbon whales remove out of the system. In the oceans, we don't have trees. Carbon is only in photosynthesis tends to be in single cellular organisms. Most of the carbon that's locked up is locked up in animals, in whales, and in fish, or in invertebrates. And when when whales die, they drop and they take that carbon out of the system. And one of my colleagues estimated that historically whales would have removed about 200,000 tons of carbon each year out of the system just through whale falls alone. This is small compared to what we would, what we produce, but it's like a large reforestation project though. It's not totally trivial. It's not going to stop probably climate. It's not going to save the folks on the coast of New York, but it's going to do a little bit in that way. I'll show this picture and take any questions if you have them. Thank you guys.
Would you be able to go back to the ecosystem services when
Yeah,
we're estimating it?
This or back more?
Depending on what you think is most important, but I'm very curious in terms of the quantification of the services that the whales provide in a specific ecosystem.
So whale watching, you got that number there, and it's been done for individual locations around the world. Primary productivity, we have that for individual species. We don't have an overall number for all. We have it for species that have been, so particular areas are for sperm whales and for blue whales as well. The whale fall habitat, I didn't have time to show it, but we've done some estimates of extinction rates. So we took out, by taking out 80% of the islands, of the habitat, and also reducing the size, which that turns out that's maybe even more important, is we took all the large ones, so the just little islands left around. We estimate there's been maybe some of the earliest extinctions in the ocean, or species that we never, before we even knew that there were whale fall communities were taken out. And then this resilience is kind of very cool stuff. I can show it to you another time. Looking at the influence of large species on perturbations. So what happens when you take out whales, or you take out tuna, you take out other large species? How does that impact system? Your ability to manage a system? It turns out you can't really manage a system. It's very difficult to manage a system. They're all jellyfish and species that are going to be are selected. They're just going to have these boom and bust cycles. So it's very hard to get that back. Put whales in the system, those perturbations tends to dampen those perturbations. And then some other work on conservation.
Do different species have different sort of whale fall patterns, or where are those happening?
What do you mean? Oh, different species of whales?
Yeah.
Not that we know. Right now we have such a tiny sampling. I would say it's mostly in the Pacific and a few other isolated places. So
it's really spotty in here and there. It's not.
That's right. It's it's just a few places where we've looked, but there's been some work in Antarctica as well. The answer is no one knows. Not that we know of. There's biogeographical patterns. We don't know if there's species patterns as well. Wow.
Thank you, Joe.
Thanks, guys.